It's meant to be an experience. That's what spirituality is. It's the experiential dimension to religion, not the dogmatic or heady dimension, but the heart dimension. And we should be encouraging the mystical experiences that are there for everybody, because mysticism is utterly natural and organic, except in a culture like ours that is based on the rational brain and runs away from the intuitive or mystical brain. And Einstein, I abhor American education. That was Einstein. He was living on Princeton campus when he said that. I abhor education. Why? He said we've been given two gifts: the gift of the rational brain and the gift of the intuitive brain. And the first gift should serve the second, because values, he said, come only from the intuitive brain, not from the rational brain. But instead, we live in a society and an educational system that honors the rational brain and ignores the intuitive brain, which is another way of saying we're not taught values in our culture, and we're certainly not taught the value of mysticism and of the ecstasy that is involved in that. So that's a basic issue, I think, for our survival.
Welcome to a Broaderlenspodcast.
The opinions expressed on Broaderlen's podcast are those of the guest speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of the host or Broaderlen's podcast.
Matthew Fox, welcome to Broaderlen's podcast. What an honor to have you on.
Thank you, Boo-Boo. Good to be with you.
Thank you. You've been a huge part of my journey, and you helped open my heart in many ways with your work. So it's really an honor to have you. So I really appreciate it. And maybe before we get started, you can share a little bit about who you are and the work that you have done.
Well, for 34 years, I was a Dominican brother and then priest. I was a theologian and publishing a number of books that seemed to resonate with a lot of people. But then the Vatican, not the current Vatican, but the previous two popes came after me, because one of my books was called Original Blessing, and a little too hard for them to take. They were too invested in original sin, which Patriarchy's invested in, but Jesus never heard of original sin. The Jews don't have original sin. Jesus was a Jew. It was not till the 4th century, St. Augustine, that term was invented. And lo and behold, it became kind of the centerpiece of Western Christianity, which is really peculiar since Jesus never heard of it. But what makes it understandable is the 4th century is when the church took over the empire. And if you're going to run an empire, original sin is a really good idea, because it gets everyone in line, and they all join the army, all that, to kill in the name of Christ. So anyway, I went back to the biblical idea that if you check out the first page of the Bible, Genesis 1, it doesn't even mention sin and evil. It's about the goodness. Everything is called good. And altogether, even when after humans come on board, and we are troublesome, no question about it, but even then, it was called very good. The whole collective, the whole circle of creation was called very good. That's how the Bible begins. But for some strange reason, well, thanks to Augustine and patriarchy and running empires, you began with original sin. And so I just try to deconstruct that and say, hey, it's not good psychology to tell people they come into the world a blotch on history and humanity. It's not good sociology, because it doesn't build up community when people are feeling bad about themselves. And thirdly, it's not good theology, because it's not in the Bible. So, but what I try to lay out is what a theology, a spirituality, original blessing would mean. And of course, blessing is a theological word for goodness. And so you begin with the fact that, hey, 13.8 billion years of history have brought us here. And there must be something good about that. We wouldn't be here. And if you look around, it's beautiful. It's amazing that we're here and that we can talk and that we can make music and dance and laugh and forgive and all the rest and grow. And so I think, frankly, I'm right and the Vatican is wrong. And back down And then they silenced me for a year. And then 3 years later, they expelled me and from the order after 34 years. And then I was very interested in reinventing the liturgy to make it more bodily and more alive, and getting prayer away from reading prayers and working with our hearts, and our hearts are in our bodies, which religion sometimes wants to forget. And make a long story short, I met some young Anglicans from Sheffield, England, who were connecting the rave movement to liturgy. And I thought that was really important. So then, again, make a long story short, I started something called the Cosmic Mass, and we've done over 125 of them in North America the last 25 years. Oh, and I became an Episcopalian then, because these were Episcopalians, Anglicans. And I said, how can I help you? But because by then the Pope had already fired me, so I didn't have a job in the Catholic Church. And they said, if you became a Episcopal priest, you could run interference for us. We're reading your Cosmic Christ theology, sharing that. So then I prayed about it, thought about it, and I went to the Episcopal bishop in San Francisco. I said, I want to become Episcopal priest, but just for one reason, to work with young people to reinvent forms of worship. And he said, go for it. The church isn't doing anything for people. So that's how I became Episcopalian, is to work with reinventing forms of worship, because I think ritual and community is really important. Melodome Some, the African spiritual teacher whose specialty is ritual, he said there's no community without ritual. And I felt that a lot of liturgy is very dead. Like I say, it's people reading prayers, and it's not very, what should I say, alluring, especially to young people. So, and obviously there's a crisis in our time because a lot of young people feel they have to take drugs to get high. But in our Mass, you get high because there's wonderful DJs and VJs and dancing, plus the story. It is a Mass, plus the story of the sharing of the bread and so forth. So I'll tell you one story about it. We were having a Mass at the Swiss Ballroom, Historic Swiss Ballroom in Oakland, where I lived for 34 years. And a woman who works with teenagers with drug problems brought a van full of her clients, if you will, about a dozen kids. And she wrote me afterwards, on the way home from the Mass, they said to her, this is the first time in our lives we've gotten high without drugs.
Wow.
So that's what worship should be. It is about stepping into a community high. That's what it's supposed to be. It's not supposed to be what page should I be on to read some prayer. No, it's meant to be an experience. That's what spirituality is. It's the experiential dimension to religion, not the dogmatic or a heady dimension, but the heart dimension. And we should be encouraging the mystical experiences that are there for everybody, because mysticism is utterly natural and organic, except in a culture like ours that is based on the rational brain and which runs away from the intuitive or mystical brain.
Mm.
And
I love that.
I abhor American education. That was Einstein. He was living on Princeton campus when he said that. I abhor education. Why? He said we've been given two gifts, the gift of the rational brain and the gift of the intuitive brain. And the first gift should serve the second, because values, he said, come only from the intuitive brain, not from the rational brain. But instead, we live in a society and an educational system that honors the rational brain and ignores the intuitive brain, which is another way of saying we're not taught values in our culture, and we're certainly not taught the value of mysticism and of the ecstasy that is involved in that. So that's a basic issue, I think, for our survival.
I totally agree. How would you define a mystic, and who are some of the most significant mystics in history, in your opinion, and what are the universal qualities or experiences they all share?
Well, for me, the mystic is the lover. The mystic is that in us which says yes to life. Now, the prophet in us says no. It says no to injustice and no to all those forces and structures that interfere with beauty and joy and compassion and justice and therefore the building and sustaining of community. So, and I'm not alone in that. William James, in his important book on varieties of human experience, religious experience, he defined, he said that the yes faculty, he said mysticism is our yes faculty. And so it's about falling in love with life. And, there's always setbacks in life. There's always a dark side, there's shadow, there's evil and mistakes, but to stay grounded and to ground ourselves in that love, and to find ways to do it. Like this painting over my shoulder about Miles Davis. I love it. It was done by a 25-year-old Oakland young black man. But music and all the arts are ways of recovering our love of life and healing, therefore, and helping others to heal. And as is this radio program of yours, this is an art form too. It's more than radio. So our work is meant to affirm our affirmation of life, our yes, the mystic in us. William Hocking, an American philosopher early in the 20th century, said, the prophet is the mystic in action. Prophet is mystic in action. So Gandhi, he was a mystic and a prophet, and throwing off the British Empire with no one getting killed was kind of like a miracle for sure. And so he put his mysticism into action, as did, of course, King, who borrowed all kinds of ideas and strategies from Gandhi, including filling the jails. And so certainly King is a contemporary mystic too. But you look at it historically in the West, because all traditions have mystics. It's a universal phenomenon. And of course, Jesus was a mystic and a nature mystic, creation mystic. That's a wisdom tradition from which he came in Israel. And he was a peasant farmer, and his father was a craftsman, and either in the craft too, as a carpenter. So those two things, being close to the earth, and it comes through in all of his parables. He's talking about nature. He's a peasant from a peasant farming community. But then the other great mystics, of course, Benedict, who founded the monastic community, the Benedictines, in the 5th century, a century after the church married the empire. And really, monasticism was, we're getting out of here. We're not going to be part of this empire and go around killing people in the name of Jesus. So that's really who was the foundation of the desert fathers and mothers that came first, and then someone like Benedict. But the ones that I really zero in on, which I think are really exciting and important today, first would be Hildegard of Bingen, a abbess of the 12th century. She was a great musician and healer and painter. She painted her visions and other things. She was a prophet. She wrote letters to the emperor complaining about telling him to man up. He was acting like a baby, that he should put more emphasis on justice. She wrote letters to the Pope and said something very similar. She told the Pope he was surrounded by evil people. And she meant the cardinals, who cackle like hens day and night, she said, and he should break from those people surrounding him. But she wrote abbots and said, she told one abbot that he acts like a bear, growling all the time. and she said you should get out of your library and get wet and moist and green and juicy. Those are her words. For her, the only sin, she said, is drying up. And she would write these abbots, say, you're drying up, get out of your library. So she was a force. So she was 12th century. Right after her came Francis of Assisi. He was born 2 years after Hildegard died. And of course, he's very much a creation mystic, of course. And then came Thomas Aquinas. And of course, I was a Dominican, and so was Thomas Aquinas. So I have a very close connection there. And then after him came Meister Eckhart, who you like for good reason. And he too was a Dominican. He stands on Aquinas' shoulders, but he was more poetic. And he worked with the women very closely of the Beguine movement, which was a women's movement of the 13th century. And they really helped him. They gave him a deeper understanding of the divine feminine. And then after him came Julian Norwich, a 15th century mystic, and she was the first woman to write a book in English. But her book wasn't published for 300 years. It's just kind of long to wait for book review because she was a woman. And so it was published in the 17th century. And I wrote a book on her during the COVID because she lived through the Great Bubonic Plague of the 14th century. And yet she very much kept her love of creation alive. She said, God is a goodness in nature. She goes on about that. And she's very positive oriented. So, and then of course, 16th century, you have Teresa of Avila in Spain and also John of the Cross in Spain. John of the Cross, of course, was a great poet, maybe the greatest poet, at least to our time in Spanish. And then moving in the 20th century, we have people like Thomas Merton, who was a Catholic monk. He was very influenced by Meister Eckhart. Eckhart converted him, actually, in 1958. But it was Dr. Suzuki, the Japanese Buddhist who brought Zen to North America, who told Merton to read Eckhart. Now, Eckhart was condemned a week after he died by a very, very corrupt papacy, pope. So he was kind of forgotten and buried in the church. And I've written 3 books on him, and I've tried to resurrect him, and I'm not alone now. A lot of other people are writing about Eckhart, and now to Hildegard too. Hildegard in many ways was forgotten too. But I started to write about her, and I've done 3 books on her, and there's a big interest in her today around the world, really. And of course, she was recently canonized a saint and declared a doctor of the church, so she's got some gravitas behind her too. But she too ran into trouble with the organized church. She was excommunicated. It was called interdicted. She and all her nuns, a year before she died, they were condemned by her archbishop because she had buried a radical young man in their cemetery. And the archbishop said, you got to get rid of that body. She said, no, he was a good man. You got to get rid of him. No. And so the archbishop sent people out to dig up the body, and she sent her nuns out to lie down on all the they couldn't dig up the body. The body is still on her property 8 centuries later. So she won that argument. But it took a whole year before they lifted the interdiction, which is a group excommunication. And then she died that year, just a few months after they lifted it. So that was one of the last acts she did was to, and she wrote him a letter and ended it by saying, those who choose to silence music in this lifetime will go to a place where there is no music in the next. Well, for her, heaven is a place of music. So she's telling this archbishop to go to hell, which is a pretty clever way of telling it, that she's going to a place where there is no music. So that's one reason it took them 800 years to canonize her, because she told the archbishop to go to hell a few months. Anyway, the mystics are interesting people. They're in touch with their creativity, and they're in touch with forces of spirit and angels that are bigger than everyday decision makers, whether in churches or other institutions. I think they're open. There's an openness to spirit, and therefore to creativity in all authentic mystical work, I think.
I love that. And one thing I love what you always say is the mystics are poets of the soul. And, paraphrasing Meister Eckhart, the mystics will understand, theologians will argue. And I felt like during my awakening, and I was telling you this, Rumi, that quote, what you're seeking is seeking you. When I had my awakening, a lot of mysticism just came to me. Never heard of mysticism, never heard of the mystics from all walks of life. And then your work came early on in my awakening. I don't think that was a coincidence. And you helped expand. About maybe 12 years ago, I started a page on Facebook. I'm no longer, that account's no longer on Facebook, but I started something in the inspiration of my awakening, mysticism in your work, on the universal consciousness of the mystics. And I like that came to me automatically,
Nice.
mysticism. So I'm truly grateful for that. And, going back to what you were saying about original sin, you said something that I love. Patriarchy is original sin. I would love for you to touch on that really quick.
Yeah, well, patriarchy is like a philosophy. It's a way of looking at the world. But I think it's a way of looking at the world in terms of control and in terms of lack of mysticism. Because it's not about joy. It's about, because mysticism is about joy, the deeper joy. That's where the yes to life comes. But I think patriarchy is defined by its compulsion to control others, and especially women, and controlling nature. And I think the whole Industrial Revolution, for example, and what we're suffering from today in terms of climate change, is an extension of the patriarchal view of the world. And we can do better than this. And it's not the same as being a male, not at all. It's unhealthy masculinity to think that we're here to control nature and one another, and especially women and others, and other people of other races or traditions or tribes or religions. And so, I mean, all that is the opposite of mysticism. And I like your phrase, universal consciousness of the mystics. Carl Jung, the psychologist, said, it's to the mystics that we owe what is best in humanity. And that's a real powerful statement. So it's the best in all of us to be lovers. And I think it's what Jesus was talking about. The bottom line is not that we put Christ on a pedestal, but that we be other Christs. And the Buddhists have the tradition of being other Buddhas. And the Jewish tradition talks about every being being an image of God. And so these, we stammer and stutter when we try to define mysticism, because definitions come from the left brain, and mysticism transcends the left brain. So there are many ways of talking about mysticism. But I like your point about the universal consciousness and the inclusivity. And again, the positivity, the yes, you see the love. So again, my simplest definition of mystic is lover. And we're all called to be lovers. And we're lovers in many dimensions. And we're lovers of life. That's a bottom dimension. I think I opened this one Eckhart book with this great quote from Eckhart. What is life? God's being is my life, I think he says. What is life? God's being is my life. Yeah. So that's real universal, isn't it? We all got being. And of course, all the beings, all creation has its wonder and its beauty and its godlikeness. And it's all a gift. We didn't start this thing. I used to talk about how we all have belly buttons in the middle of our bodies to remind us that we didn't do it ourselves. We're interdependent from the get-go. And the new creation story from science is a big affirmation, I think, of the awe and the wonder, what Rabbi Heschel calls a radical amazement, that is the real springboard for deep religion and for spirituality, for mysticism. And which also, as you say, leads to service or the prophetic dimension.
You know what I find interesting? I've always wondered this question, and you're the perfect person to ask. Why are the mystics in the Western tradition found in Catholicism and not in mainstream Christianity? Is it because you're able to contemplate and really focus on meditation and being a monk? And I would love for you to define what a monk is, the word monk.
Well, I'll start with the latter part of your question. The word monk comes from monos, that means solitude. So I like to talk about the three brains that we carry within us, the reptilian brain, the mammal brain, and the intellectual brain. And how we have to calm our reptilian brain, because reptilian brain is what's gobbling up the earth and gobbling up one another. The reptile, you don't compromise with a crocodile if you're in a fight with a crocodile. There's going to be a winner and a loser, because the reptilian brain is our oldest brain, 450 million years old. So it's dominant, and it wants to be dominant. And you see it in certain politicians and others who want to kind of rule the world. And you can see it in oneself too, of course. And so how do you calm the reptilian brain? Meditation does that, because reptiles love to be alone in the sun. So they're monks. They're like monks. Monos, being alone, solitude. So you pay attention to that solitude, the capacity for solitude we have within us. And that's the monk in all of us. And it's not just in us, as I say, even the reptiles are into it. So once you can calm that reptilian brain, then the mammal brain, which is the brain of compassion, kinship, family, and the rest, that can come to the fore. Then it can begin to flourish. And the mammal brain in us is half as old, is 210 million years old, half as old as the reptilian brain. So it kind of needs special attention. And that's what meditation does. But there are many kinds of meditation. There's not just sitting on a cushion. Even Thich Nhat Hanh, I used to go to some events in Oakland, and he would come there and do walking meditations with him outdoors in the park. And but also there's what I call artist meditation. And so again, the musician over my shoulder, but play, dance, and ritual, all that is art, is meditation. And that also calms the reptilian brain, and it brings forth the creativity too. And there are psychologists who've written about how this is the way of the prophets, that all the prophets were artists. Gandhi was an artist. He gathered the anger of his people and put it to good use, marching to the sea and so forth to throw over the British Empire. And of course, King did the same. He gathered the anger of his people, and they filled the jails, and it made a difference. So, and of course, Caesar did that too in the farmers' movement. So, Caesar Chavez. That's how I see our brains working. And now, monasticism is not the only way to go, you see. And I think there's less attraction to that now, historically, than before, because I think people begin to get it. They've got to do both contemplation and action, because there's so much that needs cleaning up in our time if we're going to survive as a species, beginning, of course, with the climate change crisis, but everything else, the wars and the nuclear wars and all that, and of course, authoritarianism that's spreading around the earth now. So we want to be able to develop this capacity for solitude, for deep, getting in touch with our deep being on the one hand, but also for putting it to work, as you said, to service. And that's the prophet in us. And we all have that capacity. It's not something restricted to monks. So I think that we're in a time when we're redefining the work of the mystic and the work of people who are not monks, but who are carrying that energy of both calmness on the one hand and energetic action into society.
I love that you said put that into action. And, I come from the 12 steps, and you brought up people in recovery earlier on. And so I'm writing a book right now on the 12 steps and mysticism. And
great.
But what I learned through the 12 steps, it's putting these principles in, placing them, putting them into action. And one of the reasons why I named my podcast Broaderlenspodcast, because mystics are seers. And the more they say when the mind is quiet, the soul will speak, intuition, and you start to clear up the window of perception. You could see things from a broader lens. And the more you climb up that mountain, the more you can see. And that's been my experience. And what does Thich Nhat Hanh talk about? Engaged Buddhism. And yeah, it's about putting this stuff into action. And I love that.
Now, can I just respond previously to you asked
Sure.
about Protestantism, distinct from Catholicism? The reason there's more mysticism in Catholicism is that it's pre-modern. You see, the Protestant era began in the 16th century, right? Lutherans, Zwinglian, those guys, Calvin. And the 16th century was the beginning of the modern era, and is very patriarchal. That's also, of course, the time just after Columbus landed in America. And so all this abuse of indigenous religions took off in the 16th century. And of course, the the doctrine of discovery from the popes of the 15th century. So my point is that at that time, things were getting more and more masculine, more and more patriarchal. And it was about, as it always is, power and money, taking the gold from the indigenous people of South America and the silver and putting it in churches in Rome and all this stuff. That was going on. But also the old mentality, and then the Enlightenment came in the next century, and this things became more heady, and even education banished the feminine in many ways. Wisdom just went out the window, and wisdom is feminine, and it was all about knowledge. So knowledge became another investment. And of course, knowledge can be a good thing, but it can also be a very dangerous thing. That we can tear down a rainforest in a day today because of our knowledge, because we built these machines that could do that. And a rainforest takes 10,000 years to happen. It's God's work and nature's work. And, that's happening literally in the Amazon and many places today. So the point is that knowledge is not enough. But for centuries, we've been defining education as knowledge and not as in terms of value. And, who is education serving? And who's profiting from it and why? And so all those things come up. But again, Protestantism is kind of anti-mystical because it really lacks the feminine in its origins. If you read John Calvin or Luther, they're not exactly feminine. They're not exactly feminist. And they're also very mired in original sin. Oh my goodness. John Calvin said, the earth is a curse. Life is a curse. And he goes on and on. These guys, you read these guys, sometimes you got to go for a drink or something, or at least go to AA because they're so deep. They don't have a sense of the ecstasy and the joy that you find in Eckhart or even Aquinas or Hildegard. But again, it's cultural as well as theological. It's just not just religion, but religion and culture are always in it together, and all that. But for example, for many years, when I was lecturing and teaching, the Protestant ministers would come up to me and they said this to me. They say, and this was said to me by at least 25 different ministers from different traditions. They said, I didn't hear a word about mysticism in my whole seminary training, they said, except one thing, that it begins in mist and ends in schism. And there's an right in the middle. That was one line they got in years of seminary training about mysticism. There's this anti-mysticism. Well, Theodore Rosak said that. He said the Enlightenment held mysticism up for ridicule as the worst offense against science and reason. So you see, the Enlightenment was so left-brain. And of course, it did a good thing. It brought knowledge and the question of knowledge in and method and all that. It brought us to some good science. But it did so as a real great price, because we dropped mysticism, we dropped intuition, we dropped values, except this one value of raping the earth as fully as we could so we make more money and have more power than in any other country or any other corporation or whatever it is we're representing. So that's an important part of your question too, that the thing about Catholicism is it does have a pre-modern memory. The Middle Ages were that. And there are some great things going on in the Middle Ages. One of my great mentors, Père Chenou in Paris, French Dominican, he said the only Renaissance that worked in the West was the 12th century Renaissance. Because the 16th century was top down. It was like popes hiring Michelangelo and all that. But the 12th century was serfs. It was young people, freed serfs, and women who were the grounding of the 12th century Renaissance. And it gave us the university in its original state. That happened in the late 12th century. It came from Islam and from Baghdad, actually. And, and it shifted things. It brought in the Gothic architecture, which is much more feminine than the Romanesque architecture that was very masculine and defensive with small windows, thick walls and all that. But the Gothic just opened things up with all this light and all this color with the stained glass and the height and everything, like a forest, the columns and a Gothic cathedral are like trees in a forest. And it was much more creation-centered, therefore, and much more balanced. It brought the feminine in. And then you had great archetypes appearing like the Black Madonna or the Green Man, which is a very essential archetype today for men because it names our interdependence with nature, especially the plant world and all this that is being destroyed so radically in our time. So I just want to say that pre-modern, and of course, also the pre-modern Christians, mystics, have a lot in common with indigenous people. The first time I translated Hildegard, she was part of the 12th century Renaissance, 12th century, pre-modern. They begin, you see, Aquinas, Hildegard, all these mystics, they begin with the cosmos, not with the human. See, since the modern age begins with us. I think, therefore I am, said Descartes. Well, bully you, but it's not true. You are Mr. Descartes because there's 13.8 billion years that preceded you, and you're here because of nature, because of creation, because of trees and soil and plants and food and animals. That's why you're here. So you're stupid to say, therefore I am. But that's been the basis of Western education for 400 years, and it's stupid and dangerous. Now we're paying the bill on it. And part of the bill is depression and addiction. You know, when people do not have this invitation to really grow their souls, like mysticism is about that. Eckhart says God is delighted to watch your soul enlarge. But when this is shut down because of bad religion, bad education, etc., then people turn to drugs and so forth because at least there's a high for a short time. And healthy religion, as I said earlier, healthy ritual delivers on ecstasy. In fact, that's Thomas Aquinas' definition of mysticism is ecstasy. And Julian Norwich defined mysticism as oning, O-N-E-I-N-G, and she invented that word. She invented a lot of words in English, including the word enjoy. She invented the word enjoy. And Eckhart's definition of mysticism is breakthrough. He invented the word breakthrough in German, Durchbruch. And he says, in breakthrough, I learn that God and I are one. So all those are ways of talking about mysticism.
I love that. And he says the soul does not grow by addition, but by subtraction.
Yeah.
And when I first came to the 12-step community, AA, I learned a set-aside prayer, set aside everything I think I know. But when you have that awakening, at least for me, a lot of the layers of conditioning, mental conditioning dissolve, and you can be more pure in heart, especially if you're doing like inner work. Blessed are the pure in heart, for you shall see God. See God where? In all things. Everything, and you're more in tune to the oneness of life.
There you go.
Yeah, so it's just, I always say, many people can read the music, very few hear the melody, and fewer still can sing the song. The mystics can do all three.
Well said. And yeah, I think the wisdom of AA is one of the most important mystical movements of our culture, and has healed so many people. But to do it, sometimes you have to undergo that line from Meister Eckhart, I pray God to rid me of God.
Yes.
Yeah, that's part of the subtraction, isn't it? You have to kind of let go of the God of our childhood, or the God of the dominant culture, or the all-male God, or the God that we put on all our dollar bills and coins and God and MX missiles. You got to shake up our understanding of the divine, and that in doing that, you're shaking yourself up too, because you're inviting growth, as you say, by subtraction, and that heals, and empowers.
I love that, and you put that in your book, I remember, and when I first read that, it was like powerful to me. And you also brought up Thich Nhat Hanh, and Thich Nhat Hanh said the Buddha was not against God, he was only against the notions of God that are where, those mental constructs that do not correspond to reality. And I really love that about him. I heard that universal consciousness of the mystics Or even that saying, if you see the Buddha on the road, kill him. Yeah, I've learned that early on with the 12 steps as well.
And what they're saying there too is that notions, they can get in our way. And then we fight over the notions. We go to war, my God can beat up your God and all this stuff. And but it's the experience that counts. That's what Don is trying to get us back to, the experiential. And that years ago I was interviewed on a TV show in Holland. And the interviewer was young, about 40, and bright. And it was a live interview on television, so the lights were there and all that. But as soon as the lights went off, the interview was over, he went forward from his chair. He said, I'm dying to ask you this question, but I couldn't dare ask it on. He said, do you North Americans still believe people can experience God? And, I've never forgotten that moment. That must have been 2020. But what else is religion about? And when it's healthy, that's what the mystics are about. It's that line from the Psalm, taste and see that God is good. And of course, God is life, So it's about tasting life and experiencing both its setbacks and the struggle and evil, but also the beauty and the wonder and the joy and the gratuity and gratitude. Like Meister Eckhart says, if the only prayer you say in your whole life is thank you, that would suffice.
That.
Yeah, I love it too. And that's mysticism, isn't it? Because it's a yes to say thank you. It's you're recognizing that life has been a gift for all of its setbacks. It's a gift to be here. And especially at this time in history, we have to keep reminding ourselves of this, because things are getting tough, and they're going to get tougher because of climate change and because of the rise of authoritarianism and so forth. We're going to have to go deeper. And that's what a spiritual life is. There's that wonderful line from John the Cross, the 16th century Carmelite mystic and poet, when he says, step out into the deep. Step out into the deep. So, don't stay on shore, safe where it's safe, but go into the deep, the depths of the unconscious, where, as you point out, there is a universal consciousness. We run into each other, and these mystics like Thich Nhat Hanh and Rumi, whom you've been citing, wonderful mystics from other traditions that overlap beautifully with our own Western mystics. So this is an invitation to find the mystic in oneself. And I'm so glad that you found it and you're operating from it.
Yeah, thank you. It seems like I said earlier on, I feel like they understood me and my experiences. Whenever you're a part of institutions or group think and challenge the dynamics of the group think, you kind of get condemned or kind of crucified in your own way. I've noticed that with the mystics, and that kind of happened to me in the 12-step community as well, because you're challenging old information to try to help bring new into the group think. And a lot of times the dogma doesn't like that. And that's been my biggest challenge. So I decided to write a book on that too, and it really helped expand in a loving way. And so, Meister Eckhart said some crazy stuff to the to mainstream thinking, right? God must cease to be God, so I can be God. I mean, that's pretty radical for some people. Who was Meister Eckhart?
Well, Eckhart was a Dominican. He joined the Dominicans at 15 years of age in Erfurt, Germany, was the novitiate. And it was the very year that Thomas Aquinas died, who was a Dominican too. And of course, Aquinas is very famous, but very controversial. As soon as he died, 3 bishops condemned Aquinas. And then it took another, 40 years, and he was canonized a saint. But in that time, all that time, Eckhart was a Dominican and, a theologian himself, etc. So there was a lot of fight and battle going on. The Dominicans were trying to get him canonized, and bishops in in Oxford and Paris, where Aquinas had taught, were condemning him. So there was a lot of hullabaloo going on. And so Eckhart actually went to Paris at the university there and taught for a while. But then he got turned off by academia. And of course, in his day, the university had become more solipsistic and more narrow than it was in Aquinas' day. So he left that and he joined he didn't join, but he linked up with the Beguine movement, the women's movement of the 13th century in Strasbourg. And it was very strong. And then Pope John the 22nd was Pope, and he condemned the Beguines 17 different times, which that wasn't working too well. And every time he condemned them, they grew more. And when that Pope died, there were like over 250,000 Beguines in Northern Europe. So the Beguines were not nuns because they didn't want to live behind a cloister. At that time, all nuns lived behind a cloister. But they weren't married either. They chose to be single and to work with the young, work with the poor, work with the sick. And they had to make a living. So many of them were craftspeople, and they did things like make stained glass and sew and all that kind of stuff. But this was before the Catholic sisters we know today. Before that happened, it was called the Third Order Sisters, where they could work in the world and get educated and all that stuff. That wasn't happening then. So, but they linked up with the Dominicans and also the Franciscans, and this Pope who so hated was threatened by them. See, because the women were not being controlled anymore. They weren't behind a cloister and they weren't married. So, hey, and the word spread, oh, these were loose women. You see, that's the word that went around. Oh, they must be loose women. And, but they linked a lot. They identified a lot with the Dominicans and the Franciscans because they too had left the monastic system. And they're doing this thing about being contemplative in the world and working in the world. So it was thanks to the Beguines that we have Eckhart's sermons, because they wrote them down for us. We wouldn't have most of his German sermons without them. He wrote his Latin sermons up, but not his German sermons, which are the most radical and lively, because he was inventing the German language at the time. He's one of the founders of the German language, so he was playing with a lot. And creating words. So anyway, he was a very famous preacher. And of course, preaching was kind of the only show in town really at that time. There was no radio or TV, Preach is okay. If you got something to say and you say it with pizzazz, people show up. So he was very popular, but he was also a real theologian, a very bright guy. And also he worked in administration. He was elected provincial and stuff like that in the Dominican order. And so he lived a very full life, but toward the end of his life, they called a trial against him in Cologne, and he won that trial. The Archbishop of Cologne was Franciscan, and they had just canonized the Dominican Thomas Aquinas. So there was this rivalry there, and I think that was part of the dynamic, the politics, let's put it that way at the time, that this Franciscan Archbishop, but also he was an aristocrat. He had von before his name, which means you're an aristocrat. Well, Eckhart gave this important teaching and sermon on the aristocrat, and he gets up in a big pulpit and tells all the poor people, and he lectured in their language, because German at the time was a peasant language. It wasn't an established language. But he told them, you are all aristocrats because you're all born noble, etc., etc., and no one is over you. Well, this did not go over well with the bishop or the bankers who had just financed the big new cathedral in Cologne and all this stuff. That really started the trouble. But he won the trial in Cologne, but then they set another trial with the Pope in Avignon. The Pope was living in France, Avignon, then, and not in Rome. And so they had this trial there. He had to walk there and everything all the way from Cologne. And then he died a week after the trial, before the judgment came out. And then the judgment came out from the Pope and condemned him. And all scholars agreed that it was a political condemnation. But the result was that his ideas went underground, because the Catholic Church, they didn't want to deal with a so-called heretic, But the Dominicans were pretty savvy back then, and they smuggled his works, some of his sermons, into Norwich in England, where it affected Julian of Norwich, and also even into Spain, where it affected John the Cross. But not in his name. They put his sermons in with John Tauler, who was a student of Eckhart and a Dominican, but had not been condemned. So they smuggled his stuff in there. It's pretty clever. They knew how to deal with heretical attacks back then, cleverly and creatively than we do today. But anyway, he came up with the radical Protestants of the 16th century, Hans Hut and Sebastian Frank and so on. They dealt with the peasants of Germany, illiterate people. In Luther's day, 70%, I think, of Germany was illiterate and were small farmers and stuff. But Eckhart was so creation-centered. He says every creature is a word of God and a book about God. And so the farmers got this, peasants got this. You don't have to go to school to know that. In fact, if you're working with the animals and the weather every day, you know how sacred these seasons are and all that, So it was the radical Protestants, including the Anabaptists back then, who were politically on the outside, who picked up on Eckhart. And then George Fox, the founder of the Quakers, he picks up on Eckhart. And because Eckhart was saying, like he says, that there's contemplation, there's mysticism, and there's action. And of course, George Fox, he went to jail and everything for his actions. And but again, Eckhart was ignored except by the philosophical academic community in the West that became more and more well, let's say less and less religious. They picked up on him somewhat. But it was when I started writing about Eckhart, right around then, some theologians started picking up. Now, the Germans did real serious work on getting his sermons out in the 50s and 60s in the critical edition. So we know what he really said. And those are the works that I worked with from the. So I just fell in love with him, and I had this dream when I was being operated on because of a serious car accident. And he came to me during the operation, and he didn't say anything. We walked together on the beach, and he had his Dominican habit on. But it was the most transcendent dream of my life. And I told a friend when I came out of the anesthesia, I said, I've been walking with Meister Eckhart on the beach. And I was writing a book then on compassion. And I found in Eckhart more teaching about compassion as a spiritual path than I'd found in any other Christian theologian. I had gone east. The Buddhists read a lot about compassion. And there was a Japanese Buddhist who became Christian who wrote a very good book on compassion. So I used that. And of course, the Jewish scholars had written a lot about compassion. But in the West, so much spirituality was about contemplation. No one talked about compassion. Whereas Jesus says in Luke 6, be you compassionate like your Creator in heaven is compassionate. So it has a lot to do with our divinization. So anyway, Eckhart led me there. And so we've been buddies ever since. And I've had wonderful experiences, including being able to share with you in your excitement about Eckhart. And as you say, he says some wild things, which is good. We could use some more wildness of a healthy kind.
You're talking about walking on the beach, and Thich Nhat Hanh says, "May every step be as I'm kissing the world with my feet." And Black Elk talks about that similar. And what I'm trying to get at is like these mystics understood each other, and I really appreciate that about them. But
Common language.
yes. Language of the heart.
Exactly, language of the heart. Yes.
How has Meister Eckhart influenced guys like Thomas Merton and Carl Jung?
Profoundly, both of them. In 1958, Merton was having correspondence with the founder of Zen, Dr. Suzuki, and whom he admired very much. Suzuki was much older than Merton. And Suzuki had written a book on mysticism, East and West. And for the Western mysticism, he takes Eckhart throughout the whole book. Eckhart is the example. He loved Eckhart. And he told Merton, he said, read your one Zen thinker of the West, read Eckhart. And Merton said, but he's been condemned by the church. This is 1958. And Suzuki said, well, I can't help that, can I? So Merton thought about the whole year of 58, reading Eckhart and Zen poetry. And you can see he totally flipped. He changed from being he had been in the monastery for 18 years. He had been basically a dualistic monk, Augustinian kind of monk. And Eckhart absolutely flipped him, because from then on, you can see in his writings, he is writing about war. He's writing about being a guilty bystander. He's writing about the prophetic side. And of course, when it comes to Vietnam War in the late 60s, he was the first religious figure in America to come out against the Vietnam War. He beat Martin Luther King to that. Now, he and King were very close, and Thich Nhat Hanh too, the three of them. In fact, they were scheduled to do a retreat together, the three of them, at his monastery. And a few days before they were going to do it over the weekend, he got a call from King. He said, I'm sorry. He said, I have to march in Memphis with the garbage collectors this weekend, so we'll get a rain check on our retreat. Well, of course, that was the weekend that King was murdered. And Merton mentions that in his journal. He says, that was fate that intervened. What if we had kept our date and King would not have murdered? But so there was a profound shift. And Merton, in his very last book, his Asian journal, when he took a trip to Asia and met the Dalai Lama, who was only 33 at the time, they fell in love and all that. But he was killed. I believe he was murdered after he gave a talk at this monastic retreat. But he was writing in his notebook, Eckhart is my lifeboat. Eckhart is my lifeboat. So that's how important Eckhart was too. And I bring it out in my book on Thomas Merton. I point out, I show how the parallels and how he's always quoting Eckhart and invoking him, you might say. So there's a tremendous connection there. And then with Carl Jung, Carl Jung said that that Eckhart was his favorite theologian, that Eckhart gave him the keys to the unconscious, he said, because Eckhart taught him about letting go and letting be. And that's, of course, the via negativa of the mystics. And so Jung did a whole long article about Meister Eckhart. He very much appreciated him and invoked him numerous occasions. Yeah.
Yeah, appreciate that. And I appreciate that you talk about female mystics as well, because they kind of got robbed. I have a book in the early 1900s, and they make a comment about females ain't capable of being mystics, and which surprised me, right? But
Yeah.
you talk about Hildegard, Julian of Norwich, Dorothy Day, Teresa Avila, Mother Teresa. I think Marianne Williamson is a female mystic in our times. Yeah, I just really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. And also Mary Oliver, if you know her poetry,
Yeah.
I think she's a real mystic of North America too, and so creation-centered. And I love her work very much. And it's very much in this lineage of finding the sacred and the healing in celebrating it. She called herself a praise poet. That's the via positiva. But she didn't come to it easily. That as a child, her father abused her sexually. And she told her mother, and as so often happens, the mother did not believe her or take her side. So the day she graduated from high school, she left home and never returned. And she says it took her years to get her life back, because she had to deal with that awful trauma of sexual abuse and incest from her father. But you don't see it in most of her poetry. She has done her inner work. She learned to let go and to find the beauty of life, and especially in nature that was so important to her. But I think it's important to tell that part of her story, because some people think she's just always praising nature. But it's part of the medicine of of having had a rough childhood. I think you had a pretty rough childhood too. So when you find this breakthrough, the mysticism in life and in yourself, things change profoundly, and then you really, as a wounded healer, you really have something to give to others in terms of compassion. You understand the dark side of life, and she does talk about that at times. She talks about the dark river of sadness, the dark river of pain. And so it's not that she doesn't talk about it, but 90%, she herself calls herself a praise poet. So, and 90% of her work is about the beauty of life, especially found in nature, this, and even in human nature at times. We're not as good at it as other creatures are. Thomas Merton has this great line. He says, "Every non-two-legged creature is a saint. Every non-two-legged creature is a saint." That really makes, I think of that when my dog is telling me what to do or something, I'm being talked to by a saint here. I better learn something,
I love that. I
I
love
love
that. I
that.
never heard that before.
No,
Even Eckhart Tolle, the famous spiritual teacher of today, named himself after Meister Eckhart. He changed his name to Eckhart, which I found interesting.
for him, yeah, that's wise.
You
Yeah.
said in the early 60s, you went to your superiors and you told them, which I think this is very courageous and crazy at the same time, telling your superiors that your generation is going to be less interested in religion, more interested in spirituality. What's the difference for you between religion and spirituality?
Well, I think religion has become more of a sociological construct. When you think of religion, you think of churches and maybe bishops or popes or cathedrals or dogma and theology and all that. But spirituality is about the experiential side. Like that question that I gave you from the Dutch television guy. Do you really believe that people can experience God, in our time? Do Americans read that? She said. So and of course, it's about the mystics, therefore, just what we've been talking about. And not just the mystics out there, but the mystic inside all of us. How do we bring it alive? How do we nurture it? And how do we help encourage and steer it into avenues of service and healing and justice making and all the rest? It's a tremendous energy, really. So that's what I meant, and it was quite, I think, intuitive that I said that when I would have been around 22, 23 years old. But I think it's true. I mean, if you look at the numbers today, so many young people have fled organized religion. And of course, we had that horrible scandal of the priest pedophilia stuff and so much else. But I talked about the treasures, taking the treasures from the burning building of organized religion, because these treasures, they're like the mystics, like people were talking about, Meister Eckhart and all these other people, to say nothing of Jesus. And, I have friends, younger friends, who are Buddhist, for example. Like one of them he's from Thailand, but lives in the Bay Area, and he's taken the pilgrimage, the El Camino pilgrimage, at least 5 or 6 different times now, the whole trip. And for a profession, he's a high school math teacher, and he's Buddhist. I said the first time he did it, I said, well, did you meet any Buddhists on the way? No, he said, I was the only one I met, etc. And I said, why did you do it? And he just stared at me, because you never ask a Buddha to do something. So then I changed the question. I said, what did you learn? He said, well, I learned that God is everywhere and in everybody and everything. But he said, I knew that already. But obviously he's very drawn to this particular Christian practice of pilgrimage. And it's not easy. When he did it the first time, his feet started to bleed halfway along the Camino. So he had to quit. He went home and taught a year. Then he went back and started up where he had left off with the bleeding feet. and finished it. But he's gone back and done it 4 or 5 different times. In fact, now he's talking about moving to Portugal to set up an inn for people who are on the El Camino path. But what I'm saying is I find a lot of young Asians who are very curious about Jesus, and are very curious not about the church as such, but about, Christianity as a path, you see. And so it's almost like, whereas the young people, many young, not all, but a certain number of young people here are interested in the East, of course. But that's a wonderful thing for the time we're living in, that we can share the wisdom. And as you say, there is a common, what I call the common underground river. A book I wrote about at Humanism, One River, Many Wells. And I got that from Eckhart, who says there's God is an underground river that no one can dam up and no one can stop. So I have this image of each religion being a well into a river, into the one river. A Buddhist well, a Christian well, a Jewish well, a Muslim well, an indigenous well, a goddess well, all the wells. So we go down our wells, but we come to one underground river. Well, you're talking about this universal consciousness of the mystics. And I think that's moving from religion to spirituality, to go deep into your tradition. Of course, AA has helped you to go deep into yourself and to be able to call on these mystics and call forth the mystic in yourself. So I think that's a sign of our times, and is one of the signs of hope in our time. The religion, instead of being at war with each other, that happens when we stay on the surface. But if you go down any tradition, you come to this common underground river. And I think a lot of young people around the world are realizing that Buddhists are realizing Buddhism isn't the only way, and Christians can realize that Christianity is not the only way, etc., etc. But that doesn't mean there's not some wisdom in Christianity. There are treasures there, as there are in all these other traditions. So for me, this is one of the real signs of hope in our time, the return of the mystical lineages coming to the fore. And so when people moan and groan about how many young people in the church, I say that may be a blessing. We have to reinvent that thing called church, and pretty fast.
I love that explanation. And you brought me back to one of the early mystics that came to me through spirit was Yogananda. And he came, I don't know if you've ever been to Lake Shrine in Pacific Palisades, but in Lake Shrine, it shows statues of Jesus, Krishna, the Buddha, and it shows these little rivers that are going into one lake, that they're bringing souls back to the one lake. They were way showers, right? And the Buddha's anonymously, you see a river of rocks going towards the lake, and Krishna, you have a little stream of river, and along with Jesus, and it's bringing you back to the one big lake in Lake Shrine.
There you go. Very nice.
So I love that.
Source of water.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You're right. People get offended when you say Jesus is a mystic, and I think he was a beautiful mystic. You call him a mystic of nature. And I love what Thich Nhat Hanh says, the further away we move from nature, the sicker we become. They were mystics, and I've always looked at Jesus as a mystic from the very beginning.
Good for you, because yes. But of course, if people don't know what mysticism is, then they think it's a threat or something to their theology. I'll tell you a story. You brought up Thich Nhat Hanh. I once invited him to come and speak at my university in Oakland. And he came with 40 nuns and monks, and they sat on the stage with him and they helped chant. We chanted some, and then he spoke. But before he got on stage, in like a green room, he was sitting to me on my right on my right, and then the monks, not the nuns, but another place, but the monks were in a circle with us, you see. And he said to me in a very soft voice, he said, "The Vatican has called me," meaning him, "the Antichrist." And I was shocked. I mean, I know the Vatican's shadow side pretty good, but this is something I had not heard before. But I kept my calm, and I said, "Really?" I said, I wouldn't worry about that. I said, "I've read both of your books on Christ, and you know more about Christ than they do." And with that, like he was right now. He started tapping my leg, and he didn't stop. He kept tapping and tapping and tapping. And I realized, I said to myself, now here's this holy monk from the East, and the 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 poobah of Christianity in the Vatican has called him the Antichrist. He's a sensitive man and a saint, and of course he would be. And it means something to him that a Christian priest and theologian, told him he knows more about Christ than they do. So I think that really healed him. But it's an amazing story. It's very touching and personal and intimate, really. But it shows how much he was hurt. But it also shows it relates to your earlier question: is to religion and spirituality. If one religion is calling a saint from another religion an antichrist, that first religion is not in very good shape. And, it deserves to collapse and be reborn more in the spirit of Jesus, its so-called founder. But it also tells me a lot about Thich Nhat Hanh. So anyway, I share that story because what can I say? Sometimes I say, well, I don't say it publicly, but I've said, I have counseled Thich Nhat Hanh. Because I did that. I just happened to be in the room with him, and he shared that sad story, but I think it cheered him up. That way be resolved.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because he's a hero of mine, just like yourself are both heroes of mine. So I really appreciate that story. One of my favorite books of his is Answers of the Heart. And he gave a talk. He shares one time where he gave a talk, and some Catholic nuns go up to him, and he said, they tell him, "We love everything you said, but you forgot one thing." And he says, "What is that?" And they said, "God. You never talked about God." And then he smiled, and he says, "What isn't God?"
Good for him. Good for him. Yeah. He says in one of his writings that the theologians he likes are those who never talk about God.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah. No, I have a friend who was a nun with him for 16 years.
Oh, wow.
And she left, but she didn't know why, because she really loved being in his community, Plum Village in France and other places. But 2 years after leaving, she fell in love with a friend of mine, Adam Bucko, who I wrote a book with called Occupy Spirituality, about young people's spirituality today. And they make a great pair. And she's Buddhist, and he's become an Episcopal priest. He's Christian. But they're starting a dual monastery together, which is both about action and contemplation, and will draw on both Buddhist and Christian wisdom. And so it's a very special marriage. And she's written some really good books. She wrote a good book called "We Are Made for These Times." We are made for these times. It's a short book with a lot of practical exercises in it about strengthening ourselves and so forth. But I think that title is very good in light of today's crises that we're going through, both in America and around the world. Are we made for these times? And of course we are. We wouldn't be here. But all of us have to go deeper. We have to do a journey like you've done. Get into the depths of ourselves, which is the mysticism, and stir things up there so that we can be of use to others. So, but I love that connection. Of course, she has many stories to tell about Thich Nhat Hanh. But I love that connection, how Thich Nhat Hanh is, and she's black. She's a black woman from the South. Her father was a minister who worked with King, was an activist minister. So, but who also fell in love with Thich Nhat Hanh. And so, it's wonderful. These different lineages are beginning to interconnect. And in you too, you see that you're carrying Thich Nhat Hanh with you. So it's not that humanity has not been blessed in our generation. It has. Thich Nhat Hanh, Dalai Lama, so many great souls have been part of our story.
Man, I'm going to have to get you back on and talk about the Black Madonna and the discovery doctrine, more on that, because so much to talk about.
Yeah, there is a lot to talk about.
I appreciate that. I appreciate you coming on. I really admire you, and I hope to be a part of your work and everyone else's to better humanity. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Boo Boo. I really appreciated conversing with you. I appreciate you having me on your program. A
I,
lot
I,
of good words said.
I'm going to ask you one quick question.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Do you feel Meister Eckhart's work is still relevant today? And how can his teachings and perspective help address the challenges of our modern times and dilemmas in today's world?
Mm. Yes, my answer, absolutely. Because, spirituality doesn't grow old. uh, it's not like science. It's always discovering new things. But there's a depth to spirituality that is perennial, if you will, that comes back because the real mystics are talking about life, and the themes they bring up are themes in the 21st century like they were in the 12th or 13th century. And that doesn't mean that we don't go deeper and learn and learn, especially now like you have, from other traditions and so forth, including the A tradition. But the point is that Eckhart is talking about issues that are hot today, or should be, like compassion. When he says that compassion means justice, for example, I mean, that takes compassion out of the realm of just feeling, or certainly not pity, but something much deeper. And of course, he's linking to the Jewish tradition there, to the prophets, of which Jesus was one. Um, that and so he talks about equality. In fact, in my most recent book, which is on the Antichrist and American politics, I have a whole chapter on Jesus and democracy. And I've never read about this before, so I said, well, I'll read some about it. And most of it is Meister Eckhart, because Eckhart gave this tremendous sermon on the aristocrat. And in it, he takes about, he's analytical, as well as being intuitive. But he takes apart the elements of justice and equality. He says we should, all of life is either living equality or making equality happen. And I end up in that chapter saying, comparing Eckhart to Thomas Jefferson, that Eckhart is including women. Jefferson didn't include women. He's including slaves. Jefferson didn't include slaves, in saying that all men are created equal, you see. I mean, it took us a civil war, and it took women 90 more years to be equal. And they're still working at it. And blacks are still working at it, too. This is civil rights is about, and voting rights, etc. So the point is that, yes, Eckhart is dealing with all kinds of issues that are hot today as they were in his day. But wisdom, like I say, is deeper than knowledge. And these people who are playing with wisdom, and that's why, a lot of Jesus' teachings, a lot of the scriptures are relevant today. Not to be taken literally, but the lessons there. And it's true of other people's scriptures as well. And so, absolutely. And my most recent book, which you have on the shelf there, I struck out a mystic warrior for a time. As you know, I put him in the room with all these different, each chapter is a different person. So I put him in the room with the new science, Thomas Berry and Teilhard de Chardin, for example. And I put him in the room with Kumar Swami and the Hindu tradition. Kumar Swami says reading Eckhart is like reading the Upanishads. Well, that is the greatest compliment a Hindu could give anybody. There you go. And I put him in the room with Thich Nhat Hanh, so Buddhism. And then with Rabbi Heschel, the Jewish tradition, and Black Elk with the indigenous tradition. So, and with Carl Jung and with Otto Rahn. So my point is that, well, I'm trying there to bring him into today's world and show the connections and the depth there that we can connect to him through these other thinkers. And of course, the Sufi tradition and Rumi and Ibn Arabi and Hafiz. So absolutely. And then I end the book with with applying to issues today like economics and education and ecumenism, and show that Eckhart has something to say that's profound and necessary on all those important topics. But then I include today's business people like Anita Roddick, for example, or what was his name? David Corton, wonderful thinkers in our time to reinvent business with a conscience, and different educators too, as it were. So, I think he's extremely relevant today. Extremely, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. You brought up the Upanishads, and that saying, that famous saying of Meister Eckhart, where he talks about the eye which I see God is the same eye which God sees me. Well,
Yes.
there's in the Kena Upanishad, there's the same similar passage there, and it's just amazing, that universal consciousness of the mystics.
Yeah, and I'm so excited that you feel that, and you finding it, and you're a hunter-gatherer looking for it too, which is very wonderful, because that's the future of healthy religion, is ecumenism, and finding these common truths that apply to all humans and all human nature. So this is the future of healthy religion, and therefore, hopefully, a healthy culture. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to end it with something you wrote from your book,
Okay.
Meister Eckhart, a mystic warrior of our times. And it's right in the very beginning. To all of us today, young and old, east and west, male and female, gay and straight, being called before time runs out on our species to be spiritual warriors on behalf of Mother Earth and leaders in the next and crucial stage of human evolution and expansion of consciousness. May Meister Eckhart challenge and inspire us all. Matthew
Hey.
Fox, thanks for coming on. What an honor.
Thank you, Boo Boo, and thank you for having a program like this. May it flourish.
Thank you. Namastizzle.
Just know we out here. Know we out here working in a major way. Had to speak on it just to make a play. Any given subject, know we make a way. Time to level up on a day-to-day. Know we out here working for the greater good. Expand your mind, broaden your lens the way you should. From the stars to the galaxy to speak on spirituality. Higher understanding for the neighborhood.